Welcome to my channel. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and like. Jake Carver never believed in fate. He believed in overdue bills stacked high on a greasy kitchen counter, scorched coffee in a rundown apartment, and the kind of rotten luck that left you stranded in a slum with a dead phone battery. That was his life, a grind of long days scraping by on petty thefts and a quick tongue sharp enough to dodge trouble. At least, that was his life until two Zorathian soldiers, towering with skin gleaming like polished obsidian, yanked him out of a stinking alley and threw him into a transport ship. Now, his wrists were bound by glowing blue energy cuffs, pulsing like they were mocking him. A spherical drone, the size of a soccer ball, hovered above, buzzing like a giant insect laughing at his expense. The air in the Zorathian detention center reeked of sterile antiseptic, a cross between a hospital and a starship, cold and sharp enough to raise goosebumps. Jake squinted as a metal door slid open, revealing a figure waiting beyond. A Zorathian, tall and lithe, her skin shimmering like black gemstone, her pale gold eyes cutting like surgical blades. Her hair, if you could call it that, was a cascade of thin, luminescent fibers, silver and cropped at the jaw, quivering faintly as if charged with static. "Prisoner 84, she said, her voice smooth but edged, like shattered glass on stone. "You're late." Jake smirked, rattling his cuffed hands, the clink echoing in the sterile silence. "Blame your flying Roomba up there. Drives like my grandma, always taking the scenic route." She didn't flinch, but the corner of her mouth twitched, a fleeting reaction so quick he almost missed it. "I am Klyra," she said, her fingers gliding over a hovering holographic panel. "Director of Human Containment Research. You're here for breaching a restricted Zorathian zone. From now on, you belong to me." Jake leaned forward, ignoring the warning beep from the drone buzzing overhead. "Belong to you? Sounds cozy. Comes with a leash, or do I have to find my own?" Klyra's gold eyes narrowed, their glow flaring like a laser. She stepped closer, her black boots silent on the gleaming metal floor. Her scent, like heated metal mixed with something wild, like alien wildflowers, hit him, making him pause for a split second. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a steel chair bolted to the floor, surrounded by sensors blinking pale blue, like soulless eyes watching. Jake flopped into the chair, slouching with one leg crossed, playing the part of a defiant punk. "What's the game, Doc? Gonna dissect me for science, or just see how I look when I'm freaking out?" Klyra didn't answer immediately. She tapped the hologram, and a screen blazed to life, displaying his profile like a digitized death sentence. "Jake Carver, 29, no family, no assets, priors for petty theft, vandalism, one dropped assault charge for lack of evidence." She scanned the data, her voice flat, like reading a grocery list. "Your record shows defiance. A survivor, against all odds. That's useful." Jake raised an eyebrow, tilting his head like he was sizing up a dinner invite. "Useful for what? Your alien trophy collection, or are you training me to be your pet?" She stepped closer, her gaze locking onto him, deep and piercing, as if peeling back his bravado to drag something buried into the light. "To understand why humans keep fighting," she said, her voice dropping. "In a war you cannot win." The screen shifted, and the image hit Jake like a gut punch. Earth, or what was left of it, burned. Cities once buzzing with life were now rubble, smoke rising from cratered scars. Human resistance groups, grimy and desperate, skulked in shadows while massive Zorathian warships, angular like blades, hovered in the sky, glowing red like blood. Jake clenched his jaw, a tightness squeezing his chest, but he forced a smirk, though it was stiffer than usual. "Sounds like you're scared we might actually win," he said, his voice light but sharp, a hidden knife in a velvet glove. Klyra didn't blink. "Fear is irrelevant. Data is not." She tilted her head, her gaze never leaving him, as if he were a puzzle she was compelled to solve. "You will be tested, physically, mentally, emotionally. Full compliance is mandatory. Understood?" Jake leaned back, the cuffs clinking, the sound ringing in the quiet. "And if I'm not a good boy?" What then, Doc? You gonna shut my brain off with that remote of yours? She didn't smile, but her eyes sharpened, like a freshly honed blade. You will comply, she said, her certainty chilling him to the bone. The drone buzzed louder, and Jake felt a sharp sting at the base of his skull, like an invisible needle jabbing his brain. The neuromonitor, he figured, some freaky tech syncing with his heartbeat, his breathing, maybe even his fleeting thoughts. The hologram flickered, showing biometric graphs, pulse at 92, cortisol slightly elevated, adrenaline steady. Klyra watched, her fingers dancing over the panel, but her eyes flicked to him for a split second, as if searching for something beyond the numbers. Jake tilted his head, his voice low. You're looking at me like I'm a bomb about to go off. Am I that scary? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she circled the chair, her boots silent, her presence like a charged storm, weighing down the air. You're not scary, she said finally, stopping inches from him, close enough that he could see faint pulses of light beneath her obsidian skin. You're a variable. And I don't like unpredictability. Jake grinned, his eyes locked on hers. Then buckle up, Doc, 'cause I'm every spreadsheet's worst nightmare. She didn't respond, but her mouth twitched again, and this time, he was sure he saw it. She turned away, entering a command, and the sensors around the chair flared, hungry. Today is just a baseline, she said, her voice cold again. Tomorrow, we begin for real. The door slid open, and the drone signaled for Jake to stand. He did, cuffs clinking, but his eyes stayed on Klyra. Free tip, he said, his tone teasing but edged with challenge. If you want me to play nice, get me some coffee. The kind that doesn't taste like ash. She didn't look back, but her shoulders shifted, like she was suppressing a reaction. The door closed, leaving Jake with the drone and a strange feeling that he just lit a spark for something bigger than himself. The testing chamber was a high-tech nightmare, cold and sleek, its walls pulsing with faint blue light like they were breathing with some living machine. Jake Carver lay flat on a metal slab, so cold it felt like his spine was freezing solid. His shirt was gone, exposing a lean, scarred body, souvenirs from his days scraping by in the slums. Sensors stuck to his chest and wrists glowed, blinking like trapped fireflies, tracking his pulse, cortisol levels, and neural spikes he didn't bother trying to understand. Klyra, her obsidian skin shimmering and gold eyes sharp as blades, circled him, holding a scanner that hummed low, like a waking beast. She moved with a scientist's precision, but Jake caught a slight tension in her shoulders whenever their eyes met. Gonna tell me what you're digging for, Doc? Jake asked, his voice lazy, drawling like he was chatting in a dive bar, not strapped to an alien's operating table. His eyes, sharp as knives, tracked her every move, from the way her fingers glided over the scanner to the faint quiver of her silver optic fiber hair when she tilted her head. Klyra didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the device. Resilience, she said, her voice flat but with a razor's edge, like she was holding something back. Humans survive things that should crush them. I need to know why. Jake smirked, his half-grin defiant. Here's a hint, we're too stubborn to quit. Jot that down, save yourself a few sessions. The scanner paused over his chest, right above his heart, and a loud beep cut through the silence. The wall-mounted screen flashed red, showing biometric curves. Pulse elevated. Adrenaline spike detected. Klyra glanced at the screen, then back at him, her gold eyes lingering a second too long, like she'd seen something that shouldn't exist. Your body is reacting, she said, her voice steady but laced with tension, like a taut wire. Jake propped himself up on his elbows, leaning toward her, his grin widening. Yeah, well, you're standing that close, Doc, not my fault my heart's doing a dance. Klyra stepped back, her face carved from stone, but Jake caught a glimpse of a secondary screen in the corner. Her own pulse was climbing, its curves twitching faintly, though she hid it by gripping the scanner tighter. Interesting, he said, his voice low, teasing like an invitation. You call this pure science, or are you feeling something too? Klyra's jaw tightened, her hands clutching the scanner until the light gleamed off her obsidian knuckles. Lie still, she snapped, her voice a blade, but Jake heard a crack in it, a tremor she couldn't mask. She adjusted the scanner, its blue light sweeping over his chest, shoulders, neck. But when her fingers brushed his shoulder, just a fleeting touch, like she'd lost focus, the screen screamed, a shrill beep echoing like an alarm. Neural sync detected, 78%. The curves spiked wildly, tracing peaks that suggested his body and hers were speaking a language either fully grasped. Klyra froze, her eyes glued to the screen, her gold pupils contracting like she couldn't believe it. "What's that?" Jake asked, sitting up, his tone curious but his eyes locked on her. "Your readings, they're anomalous," she muttered, almost to herself, her fingers flying over the scanner as if chasing an explanation. "They're accelerating. There's no reason." Jake swung his legs off the table, closing the gap between them, his body inches from hers. He tilted his head, his gaze piercing her defenses. "Maybe it's not your tech glitching," he said, his voice low and certain. "Maybe it's us. Ever consider that, Doc?" Klyra's gold eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a real fracture in her control. Her breath hitched, just for a moment, but enough for the secondary screen to flicker. Her pulse surged, syncing with his in a way she couldn't pretend to ignore. The scanner slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor with a harsh echo in the silent room. "Test over," Klyra said, turning sharply, her voice ablade, but Jake caught the quiver in it, like she was forcing herself to regain control. She strode toward the door, her boots silent, but as the door hissed shut behind her, Jake saw her pause outside. One hand pressed against the wall, her shoulders trembling, like she was fighting to breathe, to smother something burning in her chest. Jake smirked, thinking, "She's in trouble now." He lay back on the table, his eyes drifting to the ceiling, where a faint blue light pulsed, the neuromonitor, still tracking every heartbeat, every thought. But he didn't care. All he could think about was Klyra, and the way her eyes flickered when she looked at him, like she'd stumbled on a secret she didn't want to know. The doors slid open again, and a hovering drone appeared, its metallic voice barking. "Subject 84, return to containment." Jake stood, pulling his shirt on, but his eyes lingered where Klyra had stood. "She'll be back," he muttered, not to the drone but to himself. "And when she does, the real game begins." He stepped out, cuffs clinking, but in his mind those screen numbers danced. 78% neural sync, a figure that wasn't just about him, but about them both. He didn't know what it meant, but one thing was clear: Klyra, no matter how hard she tried, couldn't run from it forever. Klyra didn't sleep that night. She sat alone in her private lab, the faint blue glow of holographic readouts bathing her obsidian skin, highlighting the subtle pulses of light beneath. Around her, floating screens displayed Jake Carver's data, chaotic biometric curves, neural patterns like a storm defying prediction, and that haunting number, 78% neural sync. It defied every Zorathian biological principle she'd studied, every law she'd used to make sense of the universe. She'd spent years analyzing humans, their explosive anger, their stubborn pain, their refusal to surrender despite inevitable defeat. But Jake Carver was unlike any subject before. His defiance wasn't just resistance. It was magnetic, a pull she couldn't escape, like a collapsing star dragging her into its gravity. She replayed the test footage, her fingers zooming in on the hologram. Jake lay on the metal table, his smirking defiance blazing, his eyes tracking her like a hunter watching prey. "Maybe it's us," he'd said, his voice low and certain, like he knew something she didn't. She rewatched the moment her fingers brushed his shoulder, the moment the screen screamed 78%. Her own vitals spiked just from the memory, pulse racing, breath uneven, a heat spreading through her she couldn't extinguish. "Unacceptable," she muttered, swiping the hologram off, the blue light fading, leaving her in darkness. She was Zorathian, trained from childhood to suppress emotion, to prioritize logic above all. But logic didn't explain why her heart raced when he looked at her, why her breath faltered when he stood too close, why she couldn't erase his smirk from her mind. Klyra stood, pacing to the glass wall overlooking the dark corridors of the Zorathian detention center. Outside, patrol drones glided by, their red lights blinking like unblinking eyes. She'd spent her life becoming the perfect scientist, cold, precise, unyielding. But now one human, a petty thief with a stained past, had shaken everything she'd built. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, trying to force focus. "He's just a variable," she told herself, but the words rang hollow, like a prayer no one answered. The next morning, Jake appeared at the lab door, leaning against the frame like he owned the whole damn center. "Miss me, Doc?" he asked, his tone teasing, shrugging off his jacket without being told, revealing a lean body marked with old scars, proof of a life that hadn't been kind. The sensor's blue light played across his skin, highlighting sharp angles, and Klyra felt a jolt down her spine, though she fought to suppress it. She stood behind a thick glass barrier, operating the scanner remotely via a control panel, determined to keep distance. "Lie down," she said through the intercom, her voice ice-cold, but she knew he could hear the strain beneath it. Jake complied, flopping onto the metal table, but his smirk didn't fade. "What's with the fortress?" he asked, his eyes flicking to the glass, like it was just a flimsy curtain. "Scared I'll make your tech blush again?" The scanner hummed, its blue light sweeping over him, and the main screen flared. "Cortical response, 82%. The number hit Klyra like a punch. Her fingers froze on the panel, her heart pounding despite her will to stay calm. "Your reactions are anomalous," she said, avoiding his gaze, focusing on the dancing numbers. "They're outside projections." Jake sat up, slow and deliberate, his eyes piercing the glass, like he could see straight into her mind. "Anomalous, huh?" he said, his voice low and mocking. "Fancy way of saying you're rattled, Doc." She cut the intercom, hoping to silence him, but Jake didn't stop. He stood, stepping toward the glass, each step a drumbeat in her chest. "You can hide behind your toys, Klyra," he said, his voice low but sharp. "But I saw your readings yesterday. Pulse spiking, breathing all over the place. You're in as deep as I am." The scanner beeped again, a shrill alarm. "Sync rising, 85%. Klyra felt blood rush to her ears, a hot-cold sensation flooding her. She flicked the intercom back on, her voice ablaze. "You're just a variable, nothing more." But her words were weak, like she was trying to convince herself. Jake pressed his palm against the glass, leaving a faint smudge, his eyes never leaving her, like he was daring her to cross an invisible line. "Keep telling yourself that, Doc," he said, his voice a whisper. "But you'll have to face it, this isn't just data. This is us." Klyra stared at his hand on the glass, and for a moment she imagined crossing that line, touching him, letting every protocol crumble like a demolished building. The image was so vivid she almost couldn't breathe. Her hand hovered over the test kill switch, trembling, but she didn't press it. Instead, she met his gaze, her gold eyes locking onto his, and for the first time, she wondered if the anomaly wasn't Jake, but her. She'd spent her life striving to be a perfect machine of Zorathian logic, but now, one human had made her question everything. "Test over," she said, her voice stiff, turning sharply to hide the flicker in her eyes. She stormed out of the control room, but as the door hissed shut, she paused in the corridor, one hand braced against the wall, her breathing heavy. She felt like she was falling, not into the void, but into something far more dangerous. Jake Carver. Back in the lab, Jake stood alone, his eyes drifting to the ceiling's pulsing blue light, the monitor, still watching. He smirked, muttering, "You can't hide forever, Doc." Deep down, he knew the crack he just made in her wall was only going to grow. Jake followed the drone out of the lab, his cuffs clinking, his eyes lingering on the corridor where Klyra had vanished. The drone's buzz was a warped lullaby, guiding him through icy corridors back to containment. In the darkness, the neuromonitor at the base of his skull stung, a reminder that the center never let him go, day or night. He collapsed onto the stone-hard bed, the ceiling's faint blue light blinking like sleepless eyes. "Sleep tight, Doc," he muttered, smirking, though his heart still pounded from the moment her eyes wavered. He closed his eyes, but a storm was coming, and he knew when it hit, either of them would be the same. The summons came at midnight, a robotic voice slicing through Jake Carver's containment cell like a cold blade, where he sprawled on a bed hard as granite, staring at the ceiling's pulsing blue glow. "Prisoner 84, report to the containment core immediately." The voice droned from the neuromonitor on his wrist, emotionless, like it was reading his obituary. Jake sat up, rubbing his neck, the faint sting of the neural device still simmering at the base of his skull. "No rest for the wicked, huh?" he muttered, standing and pulling his shirt on. The corridor to the core was colder than any he'd seen, the air heavy with the acrid tang of scorched metal and something like ozone. The walls, coated in shimmering alloy, reflected red sensor lights, watching, judging every step. A drone hovered behind him, its low buzz a wordless warning. When the door slid open, Jake stepped into a new room, darker, colder, the space swallowing sound like a void. Klyra stood alone, her obsidian skin pale under the harsh ceiling lights, highlighting the silver pulses tracing her arms. Her gold eyes gleamed with tension, like she was teetering on the edge of an invisible cliff. Jake glanced at the metal chair in the center, ringed by sensors blinking red, energy cords coiling around it like living snakes. "New digs?" he asked, his tone teasing but his eyes locked on her, probing for a hint of what was coming. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Doc. What's got you spooked?" Klyra didn't answer immediately, just gestured with a stiff nod. "Sit. This is a stress simulation." Jake sank into the chair, the metal's chill biting through his thin shirt. He tilted his head, his gaze never leaving her. "Stress simulation? Fancy talk for torture." She activated a holographic panel, and a low hum filled the room, like a ship's engine priming for launch. The energy cords tightened around his wrists and ankles, locking him in, their grip like fire grazing his skin. Klyra stood at the panel, her fingers gliding over controls, but Jake caught her hand trembling slightly, a tell she couldn't hide. "Your sync levels have been flagged," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, like she feared someone was listening. "The center wants answers." Jake smirked, but the grin didn't reach his eyes, cold and sharp as a blade. "Answers or an excuse to bury me?" He leaned forward, ignoring the cord's tightening burn, his skin reddening. Klyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw real fear in their gold depths, not the strain of a scientist, but the dread of someone facing something uncontrollable. "They'll erase you," she said, her voice trembling, nearly breaking. "Your data, your existence, everything. They don't allow anomalies to persist." The sensors blazed, the wall screamed flaring with numbers. Severe stress response. Pulse 145. Adrenaline 92%. Jake's heart pounded, but he kept his voice low, cutting. "So why are you still running their tests? If you know they want me gone?" Klyra's hand shook harder as she adjusted the panel, her fingers darting over controls like she was searching for a way out, a delay to the inevitable. "Because if I stop," she said, her voice so low it was barely audible, "they'll know I'm compromised." Jake laughed, a sharp, bitter sound echoing in the silent room. "Compromised? Klyra, you're not a machine. You feel this too, same as me. Don't pretend you don't." She froze, her fingers hovering over the panel, her eyes flickering like he'd touched an open wound. The secondary screen blinked, showing her own pulse spiking, syncing with his at 87%. Jake tilted his head, his gaze pinning her. "See? Data doesn't lie. You're in deep, Doc." The door hissed open, and a Zorathian official stepped in, severing the moment like a guillotine. Older than Klyra, her silver pulses gleamed under black skin, her eyes cold as the void, devoid of warmth. "Director Klyra," she said, her voice like ice, each word carved with lethal precision. "This subject's data is remarkable. The High Council demands immediate transfer." Klyra stepped forward, positioning herself between Jake and the official, her posture rigid like a living wall. "He's my responsibility," she said, her voice firm, though Jake saw her hand clench, the pulses on her skin flaring. The official, Chief Vera, her nameplate red, narrowed her eyes, silver glinting like a laser. "You dare defy the center?" she asked, her tone smooth but laced with unspoken menace. Klyra didn't back down. "If I must," she replied, and Jake heard her resolve in her voice, like she'd crossed a line with no return. He stood, ignoring the cord searing his skin, his heart racing. "You sure about this, Doc?" he asked, his voice low, both challenging and concerned. Klyra turned to him, her gold eyes blazing like fire, no hesitation. "I'm sure," she said, and in that moment Jake knew she wasn't just protecting him, she was defending something bigger, something they were both starting to feel. Vera's lips curved in a smile, cold and devoid of warmth, like a predator eyeing trapped prey. "You have 1 hour to reconsider," she said, her gaze flicking from Klyra to Jake, memorizing every detail for later use. "After that, the subject will be transferred, and you will be evaluated." She turned and left, leaving a heavy silence, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Jake looked at Klyra, his voice low but sharp. "You just threw it all away, career, status, everything. For a guy like me." Klyra turned, her eyes softening, but her voice held firm. "Not everything," she said, and in her gaze, Jake saw a sincerity that stopped his heart. But as she turned away, he saw her hand tremble, the pulses on her skin flickering unevenly. He knew they just stepped into a deadly game, where either knew the rules, and time was running out. Jake smirked, muttering, "You want to play big, Doc? I'm in." But deep down, he felt a new surge of adrenaline, not just from the danger, but from her, and from something growing between them, defying every Zorathian protocol. Klyra led Jake through a narrow auxiliary corridor, the dim light from alloy wall panels barely enough to see, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to chase them. The air was frigid, thick with the scent of metal and machine oil, each of Jake's steps echoing with a dry clank on the floor. He kept his voice casual, but his eyes were sharp as knives, scanning every corner, every blinking red sensor on the ceiling. "What's the plan? Stash me in a broom closet?" he asked, half joking, but his gaze stayed wary, ready to react if this was a trap. Klyra didn't turn, her steps quick and sure, her black boots silent. She stopped at an unmarked door, a gray slab blending into the wall. Her fingers flew over a control panel, entering a long code with the speed of someone who'd done it 100 times. "Not a closet," she said, her voice low, laced with tension Jake recognized instantly. "This is my safe room." The door hissed open, revealing a small, dark chamber, 3 walls covered in holographic screens glowing with faint blue light, like silent waves. The screens displayed data, not just Jake's, but dozens of humans, each tagged with bold red text. "Anomalous sync." Biometric curves danced, DNA spirals twisted, and numbers blinked, telling a story Jake didn't yet grasp. He paused, his eyes scanning each screen, a chill running through him as he realized he'd stepped into the heart of a secret bigger than himself. "You're not just studying me, are you?" he said, his voice low, a mix of curiosity and suspicion. He turned to Klyra, his gaze locking onto her, searching for a crack in her cold facade. Klyra stood before a screen, facing him, her gold eyes shimmering but tinged with unease, like she was weighing how much to reveal. "I'm not just a research director," she said, her words deliberate, each chosen with care. "I'm part of the Secret Council, a group of Zorathians opposing the Center's genocide of humans. We believe humans aren't a threat, but potential allies." She touched the screen, zooming in on Jake's data. "Neural sync, 85%. Zorathian tech compatibility, 92%. Your data is the key. It proves humans and Zorathians can connect, not just through war, but through something deeper." Jake let out a dry laugh, shaking his head, leaning against the cold wall, the energy cuffs still biting lightly at his wrists. "So I'm a lab rat for your rebellion? Or are you just keeping me alive to play with my numbers?" He tilted his head, his eyes challenging, but deep down, a new surge of adrenaline hit, not from danger, but from the idea that he might be part of something bigger than his scrappy life. Klyra stepped closer, so close Jake felt the strange warmth of her obsidian skin, both alien and familiar. "I want you alive," she said, her voice hoarse, carrying a sincerity that stopped him cold. Not for the data. Because you make me question everything I've ever believed. Jake stared at her, his heart pounding, not from the cuffs or scanners, but from the way she looked at him, like he was the answer to a question she'd never dared ask. Her gold eyes were no longer cold, but burning, like a fire long suppressed. He opened his mouth, ready to fire back, a quip, a challenge, but before he could, a sharp beep cut through, blaring from Klyra's wrist device, slicing the moment like a blade. Alert, containment core breached. Subject 84 required for immediate transfer. The main screen flashed red, showing a map of the center with moving dots, Zorathian security teams closing in on their location. Klyra clenched her fist, the pulses on her skin flaring unevenly. They're early, she muttered, her voice taut, but her eyes sharp, calculating every option. Jake smirked, but his eyes were cold, ready for whatever came next. Guess playtime's over, he said, stepping closer, his voice low. Got a plan, or do I punch my way out? Klyra tapped a screen, and a holographic map of the center appeared, detailing corridors, hangars, and security weak points. We steal a patrol ship and get to the outer belt, she said, her fingers tracing a route with precision. But I need you to trust me. Jake studied her, his eyes tracing her face, from her blazing gold eyes to the slight purse of her lips, like she was braced for rejection. He weighed his options, adrenaline surging, not just from the danger, but from the realization she was risking everything for him. Lead the way, Doc, he said finally, nodding, his voice firm but laced with his usual tease. But if I die, I'm haunting you forever, got it? Klyra gave a small smile, the first real one he'd seen, soft, but radiant, like light through a crack. Try it, she shot back, her tone carrying a hint of challenge, and in that moment, Jake knew they weren't just partners in a breakout. They were allies, and maybe something more. She entered a code, and the room's screens dimmed, leaving them in faint light. Klyra pulled a small device from her belt, a pulse grenade, Jake guessed, and motioned for him to follow. Stay quiet and stick close, she said, her voice low but sharp. Jake smirked, stepping close, her warmth an anchor in the storm ahead. Don't worry, Doc, he muttered. I'm not wandering off. They slipped out of the safe room, the door sealing behind them, the dark corridor swallowing them whole. In the distance, heavy metallic footsteps echoed, security was closing in. Jake clenched his fists, his heart pounding, but he glanced at Klyra, and in her eyes, he saw unshakable resolve. They weren't just escaping. They were defying an empire. They tore through the service corridors of the Zorathian detention center, red alarm lights flashing on the walls, bathing everything in a hue of danger. Jake Carver ran close behind Klyra, his breath ragged, his heart hammering like it might punch through his chest. The corridor was narrow and stifling, reeking of scorched metal and machine oil, clinging to every inhale. Klyra led the way, her black boots gliding silently, her fingers flying over her wrist device, entering override codes to disable the patrol drones hovering above. But heavy metallic footsteps thundered behind, not drones, but elite Zorathian soldiers, their armor glinting, energy weapons hissing like angry snakes. You sure this is a bright idea? Jake panted, his voice rough as they veered into a tight corner, nearly slamming into a cold alloy wall. No, Klyra snapped, her voice sharp but edged with strain, her fingers punching codes into a wall-mounted panel. A hatch hissed open, revealing a dark maintenance tunnel below. But it's the only one. She gestured for Jake to climb down first, her gold eyes scanning the corridor, gauging how close the security team was. Jake smirked, sweat rolling down his forehead. You really know how to keep a guy on edge, Doc. He scrambled down, gripping icy metal rungs, the energy cuffs on his wrists pinching as a reminder he was still a prisoner. Klyra followed, sealing the hatch just as the metallic footsteps grew louder, mere meters away. The maintenance tunnel was cramped, its walls streaked with oil and sprouting cables like the veins of a massive machine. Dim light from ceiling panels barely lit the way, casting warped shadows that trailed them. Jake took point, following Klyra's directions, adrenaline spiking with every odd sound, a machine's hiss, a distant metallic clank. "If we die down here," he said, half joking, "you better promise me a statue, all right?" Klyra didn't laugh, but her eyes softened. "Focus, Carver. We're not dead yet." At the tunnel's end, a door led to a hangar, where a sleek, angular patrol ship sat dormant, like a beast in slumber. Klyra darted to the main console, her fingers dancing over controls, firing up the systems with the ease of a lifelong expert. But before the engines could warm, a deafening blast shook the tunnel. The hatch behind them exploded in a plasma burst, smoke and debris flying. "Son of a..." Jake muttered, snatching a jagged metal rod from the floor, gripping it like a crude weapon. 3 Zorathian soldiers emerged through the smoke, their armor flashing silver, energy weapons hissing with deadly blue light. Klyra spun, pulling a small device from her belt, a pulse grenade, small but lethal. "Cover your eyes!" she shouted, hurling it at the soldiers. Jake turned, squeezing his eyes shut as a blinding flash erupted, crippling the guards' electronics. The weapon's hum died, replaced by the clatter of metal hitting the floor. Jake didn't wait. He charged, swinging the rod hard into one soldier's head, the impact dropping him. The second tried to rise, but Jake's boots slammed into his chest, sending him sprawling. "Not bad, Doc!" he yelled, adrenaline pumping, glancing at Klyra as she took down the third with a precise strike to the neck. She didn't reply, just motioned for him to board the ship. They leaped into the cockpit, Klyra sliding into the pilot's seat, her hands flying over the controls like a maestro. The engines roared, the ship lurching as it shot out of the hangar, the red alarm lights fading behind them like a menacing farewell. But the relief was short-lived. A shrill beep sounded from the console, the radar flaring. "Ship targeted." "They're firing!" Jake shouted, eyes glued to the radar's glowing dots, representing energy cannons in pursuit. Klyra gritted her teeth, her hands weaving the ship through a barrage of energy bolts, each dodge tilting the craft wildly. "Hold on!" she barked, her fingers entering codes to jam the targeting systems. Jake watched her, unable to suppress admiration for her calm under fire. Her eyes like blades, every move precise, though the pulses on her skin flickered unevenly, like she was battling herself too. Finally, she entered a final code, and the ship surged forward, breaking free of the cannon's range. The void stretched outside the viewport, a black sea of stars, glinting like diamonds. Jake exhaled, slumping back, sweat dripping down his face. "I think I just aged a decade," he muttered, glancing at Klyra. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, just a fraction. But before they could relax, a message flashed on the console, red and unrelenting. "Subject 84 data transmitted to High Council. System-wide manhunt initiated." Jake gave a dry laugh, the sound harsh in the cramped cockpit. "Great. Now I'm the most wanted guy in the galaxy. Any medals for that?" Klyra turned to him, her expression complex, resolve mixed with worry, like she carried the weight of both their fates. "Not just you," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Me too." Jake met her gaze, adrenaline still coursing, but now laced with something else, a bond, a silent vow. He tilted his head, smirking. "Then we better get good at running, Doc." She didn't reply, but her eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Jake knew they weren't just fugitives. They were a team, and no matter what the universe threw at them, they'd fight to the end. The patrol ship glided through an asteroid belt, massive rocks drifting silently in the cosmic dark, faintly glinting with starlight from distant suns. In the cramped cockpit, Jake Carver sat across from Klyra, the dim glow from the control panel casting sharp angles across her face, highlighting the silver pulses threading her obsidian skin. The air was thick, not just with the scent of scorched metal and burnt plastic from the ship's systems, but with unspoken questions hanging between them. Jake crossed his arms, his eyes sharp as blades, never leaving her. "You owe me some answers," he said, his voice low, carrying a steely resolve. "The Secret Council, the rebellion, my data, what's it all about? No dodging, Doc, I've risked my neck following you, now I want the truth." Klyra sighed, looking weary for the first time, as if the weight of a world pressed on her shoulders. The pulses on her skin flickered unevenly, mirroring her inner turmoil. She leaned forward, hands on the console, her gold eyes scanning Jake, weighing how much he could handle. The Zorathians have conquered dozens of species across this galaxy, she began, her words slow, each chosen with care. They call it integration, but it's erasure. Species are assimilated or wiped out if they resist. But humans, you're different. She paused, her gaze deep, like she was peering into a mystery she hadn't fully unraveled. You don't just survive under pressure, you evolve. You find ways to break every limit, whether it's war, starvation, or despair. She tapped a small screen on the console, and a holographic chart flared to life, displaying Jake's biometric data, neural curves dancing chaotically, sync numbers blinking red. Zorathian tech compatibility, 92%. Your data shows an unprecedented neural sync. She continued, her voice quieter. Not just with me, but with Zorathian technology itself. You could disrupt their systems just by existing. That's why the center wants you gone. Jake frowned, shaking his head, trying to process her words. I'm a petty thief, Klyra. Not a superhero. I survive because I have to, not because I'm special. Klyra shook her head, her eyes fierce, like she was willing him to see what he refused. She zoomed in on a DNA chart, its double helices shimmering, laced with strange markers, codes that weren't human. No, she said, her voice sharp but tinged with worry. You're not just human. Your genes carry traces of a Zorathian experiment from centuries ago, a hybrid project they scrapped. They tried to forge a species blending Zorathian strength with human resilience, but it was deemed a failure, erased. Or so they thought. She pointed to the chart, where Zorathian markers glowed like tiny stars. You're the result. Part human, part us. Jake stared at the chart, his heart pounding like a fist against his ribs. What? He growled, surging to his feet, his voice trembling with anger and confusion. I'm part of you. He slammed his fist into the cockpit wall, the metallic clang echoing, pain shooting up his arm, but he didn't care. Why didn't you tell me sooner? You let me run like a rat in a maze, knowing this all along? Klyra stood, facing him, unflinching despite the fire in his eyes. Because I wasn't sure, she said, her voice hoarse, raw with honesty that stopped him cold. I only suspected until your data confirmed it. And because... She faltered, her eyes flickering, like she was wrestling with herself. Because I was afraid you'd walk away. Jake glared, his chest burning with rage, but as their eyes locked, he saw something in her gold gaze, sincerity, fear of losing him, a vulnerability she rarely showed. He took a deep breath, reining in the storm inside, his voice rough. You're wrong, he said, stepping closer, close enough to feel the strange warmth of her skin, both alien and familiar. I don't walk away. I'm not the quitting type. But from now on, no more secrets. Got it? Klyra nodded, her eyes never leaving his, like she was sealing a silent pact. Got it, she said, her voice soft but certain. In that moment they stood close, their breaths mingling, the tight cockpit shrinking until it was just them. Jake felt a current surge through him, not from cuffs or scanners, but from her proximity, from the way she looked at him, like he wasn't just a subject, but a choice. He reached out, his fingers brushing her arm, tracing the flickering pulses beneath her skin. Klyra didn't pull away, but her breath hitched, and in her eyes Jake saw a spark, like she was fighting her own battle. What's next? He asked, his voice low, laced with challenge. Klyra tilted her head, her eyes igniting with resolve. We head to the fringe point, she said, pointing to the radar, where a tiny dot blinked, an abandoned outpost in the asteroid belt. It's a safe haven for now. From there, I'll contact the Secret Council, send your data to those who need it. Jake smirked, leaning back, but his eyes stayed locked on her. Sounds like a plan. But what if they find us first? Klyra met his gaze, her gold eyes blazing. They won't, she said, her voice unwavering. Not while I'm here. And in that moment Jake knew that, no matter how hard the truth about himself was to swallow, he'd chosen the right person to stand with. The patrol ship glided through the asteroid belt, massive rocks drifting silently in the dark, like forgotten tombs. Jake sat in the cramped cockpit, eyes glued to the radar, where no dots appeared, yet. The air reeked of scorched metal, but Klyra's warmth beside him dulled the cosmic cold outside. "You sure this fringe point is worth the risk?" he asked, his tone half-teasing, but his eyes sharp, searching for any hint of doubt. Klyra tilted her head, the pulses on her skin flickering, her gold eyes locking onto his. "It's our only shot," she said, her voice low but firm, like a vow unspoken. Jake smirked, leaning back. "Better have decent coffee then, Doc." She didn't laugh, but her eyes softened, and in that moment, amid stars and a galactic manhunt, they were a team, defying all odds. The ship shuddered, engines roaring as it prepped for landing, and Jake clenched his fists, ready for whatever awaited. The patrol ship touched down on the fringe point. A derelict outpost sprawled across a red rock desert under a bruised purple sky, stars faintly flickering. Wind howled through rusted metal structures, kicking up red dust that clung to Jake Carver's jacket as he stepped off the ship, the grit crunching under his boots. The air was dry, bone-chilling, like the planet had died long ago. Klyra led the way, the pulses on her skin glowing faintly, her gold eyes scanning the desolate landscape for threats. "This place looks like a graveyard," Jake muttered, rubbing his neck, where the neural monitor still throbbed. "You sure it's safe?" Klyra didn't turn, her voice low but steady. "For now. Even Zorathians don't come here anymore." They barely had time to catch their breath before the outpost's alarm screamed, a piercing wail echoing through the crumbling corridors. The main control room's screen flashed red, showing a fast-approaching blip, a Zorathian hunter ship, small but lethal, packing enough firepower to level the outpost. "They're faster than I thought," Klyra muttered, sprinting to the armory, checking metal crates filled with energy rifles and pulse grenades. Jake grabbed a rifle, inspecting it with surprising ease, his fingers gliding over the trigger like he'd been born for this. "Ever shot one of these, Doc?" he asked, smirking, his eyes glinting with challenge. Klyra glanced at him, her lips twitching in a rare smile. "I'm Zorathian. We don't need guns. But I learn fast." They set up defenses, using the outpost's rugged terrain, shattered walls, red rock outcrops, for cover. Jake crouched behind a boulder, rifle ready, adrenaline surging like a live wire. Klyra stood beside him, clutching a compact pistol, her eyes slicing through the purple sky. The hunter's ship landed a few hundred meters away, kicking up a red dust storm. But when the hatch opened, it wasn't the elite soldiers Jake expected. Chief Vera stepped out, her obsidian skin pulsing with silver, her eyes cold as the void. Flanking her were Zorathian guards, their energy weapons hissing, and a human. The man, clad in black, tall and broad, had eyes like steel, staring at Jake like he was cargo. "Subject 84. Vera said, her voice smooth but sharp, like a velvet-sheathed blade. "And Klyra, the traitor. Surrender the data, and you may live." Jake gripped his rifle, the metal cold under his hands, his eyes fixed on Vera. "Live how? In a cage? Thanks, but I'll take freedom." The human man stepped forward, his voice low, dripping with cold confidence. "I'm Marcus. I work for the Zorathians. And I know what you are, Jake. A weapon. Don't let her use you." Klyra moved, positioning herself in front of Jake, her eyes narrowing. "He's your clone," she said, her voice low but cutting. "A Zorathian-made version, built to obey. He has no free will." Jake stared at Marcus, a chill racing down his spine. The man mirrored him, low voice, confident stance, even the same smirk, but his eyes were empty, like a machine in human skin. "You're wrong," Marcus said, drawing an energy pistol from his belt. "I chose this path. And you will too, or die." The battle erupted like a storm. Jake and Klyra fell back into the outpost, using the terrain to dodge gunfire. Jake took down 2 guards, each shot precise, but Marcus was faster, charging through the barrage, his fist slamming into Jake's chest, knocking him to the ground, breath choking in his throat. "You can't beat me!" Marcus snarled, looming over him, pistol aimed at his head. "I'm your perfect version." Jake smirked, blood trickling from his lip. "Perfect? You're missing a heart." He kicked Marcus's knee, flipping the fight, grabbing his rifle and firing into Marcus's shoulder. Marcus collapsed, but Vera activated a remote device, and the outpost quaked, a massive explosion splitting the ground. Klyra yanked Jake to his feet, her grip tight on his wrist, dragging him through smoke and debris. They dove into a small escape shuttle in an auxiliary hangar, Klyra firing up the engines as the outpost crumbled behind them, red dust and fire swallowing everything. Jake panted, slumping in his seat, eyes locked on Klyra. "You okay?" he asked, voice rough. She nodded, but her hands trembled on the controls. "You!" Jake wiped blood from his lip, smirking. "Surviving, as usual." The escape shuttle drifted through space, its engines wheezing, power so low the cockpit's dim lights barely held back the dark. Jake Carver sat across from Klyra, his body aching from the fight, dried blood crusting his lip. The silence was broken only by the hiss of the ventilation system and their steady breaths. "You know," Jake said, his voice hoarse, laced with dry humor. "I never thought I'd die in a tin can floating through space. At least I figured there'd be better coffee." Klyra looked at him, her gold eyes softer than ever, like her walls of control had finally collapsed. "You're not dead," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And I won't let you die." Her hand touched his, her fingers cold but carrying a warmth that stopped him short. For the first time, there were no scanners, no protocols, no data, just them, two souls in a dying shuttle. "I sent your data to a human resistance network before we left the center," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "They know who you are, Jake. They know about the hybrid genes, your potential. They'll find us." Jake stared, his heart pounding, not from danger but from her, the woman who'd thrown away her career, her loyalty to the Zorathians, to stand by him. "Why'd you do it?" he asked, his voice low, raw with curiosity. "For the data? The rebellion? Your secret council?" Klyra shook her head, her fingers tightening around his, like she feared he'd slip away if she let go. "Because you make me feel alive," she said, her voice rough, barely a whisper. "For the first time, I wanted something not for logic, not for protocol, but because I chose it. I chose you." Jake looked at her, the universe shrinking to this moment. He pulled her close, their foreheads touching, breaths mingling, the cramped space fading away. "Then we choose together, Klyra," he said, his voice steady. "Live or die, but together." They kissed, unhurried, the taste of blood and desperation binding them. The kiss was deep, a vow forged in survival. But a sharp beep from the console shattered the moment. A distant signal blinked on the radar, with a brief message. "Subject 84, this is the human resistance. Prepare for rendezvous." Jake pulled back, his smirk returning, though his eyes still shimmered with emotion. "Guess I'm not dying yet," he teased. Klyra smiled, a real smile, her eyes sparkling like stars. "Good," she said. "Because I'm not done with you." They stood, prepping for the meeting, but Jake grabbed her hand, holding her back for a second. "You know," he said, his voice low, "if we make it through this, you owe me a coffee. The kind that doesn't suck." Klyra tilted her head, her eyes glinting. "Deal." The human resistance ship brought Jake and Klyra to a hidden base deep in a meteor belt, where massive rocks drifted silently, shielding them from Zorathian radars. The base was a network of reinforced caves, lit by faint blue panels glowing along the corridors. The resistance commander, a woman with cropped silver hair and eyes like steel, greeted them in the main hangar. "Jake Carver," she said, her voice low but commanding. "You're the key. But not just you." She led them through narrow tunnels to an underground lab, where holographic screens lined the walls, displaying sync data for dozens of humans, all bearing Zorathian genetic markers, like Jake. The hybrid project didn't just create you, the commander explained, pointing to a glowing DNA chart, thousands of dots representing individuals scattered across Earth. The Zorathians experimented centuries ago, forging hybrids of their strength and human resilience. They thought it failed, but you're proof they were wrong. Klyra's data shows humans and Zorathians can unite, not just in war, but as allies. Klyra stood beside Jake, her expression complex, like she was grappling with the scale of her actions. I didn't know it was this big, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. I just wanted to save him. Jake squeezed her hand, his grip firm, his eyes resolute. You did, he said, his voice steady but warm. And now we'll save the world. They stepped out of the lab, standing under the base's starry sky, visible through a transparent dome. They were no longer prisoner and scientist, but two people who'd chosen each other, defying every rule, every boundary of species. In the distance, the comms room sent a message to resistance cells across Earth and beyond. Data confirmed, humanity is not alone. Prepare for counterstrike. Jake looked at Klyra, his smile wide, eyes sparkling like the stars above. Ready to shake up the galaxy, Doc? He asked, his tone teasing but laced with deep sincerity. Klyra tilted her head, her gold eyes gleaming, a small smile curving her lips. With you, she said, her voice light but certain. Always. They stood hand in hand, gazing at the meteor belt, where the future of humans and Zorathians was being rewritten. And though the war ahead was perilous, Jake knew that with Klyra by his side, they could face anything.